Hey guys, and welcome back to another Let's Draw. Today I'm going to be doing a speed painting. This is another version of the tattoo I've been working on. It's just something that I've been wanting to play with in Photoshop, just trying to get a feel for Photoshop, how to digitally paint and draw with Photoshop instead of Illustrator. Illustrator I really like because it does a little bit of auto line correction. So whenever you draw, it actually kind of auto corrects the lines whenever you're drawing for you. Now in Photoshop it's a little bit different. It's kind of like drawing with a pencil and paper. So if you've ever done shading or texturing or just kind of gone back in and touched up some of your line work, it's kind of the same way. Especially if you turn on the pen pressure sensitivity, that really does help. So here what I'm doing, I'm just laying down kind of the way that I just draw a little bit of shading here and there and just start seeing where the shapes take me. Based off that, then I'll start dropping down my line work. And here I'm just kind of doing also some line work with some of the base shadows. I'm just trying to get a feel of where the piece is going to take me. Like I've said before, I draw a little bit unorthodox. I kind of see where a piece takes me versus rather having out a general idea like this is where I'm going. It works for me. It's not for everybody. It helps me, especially like when I'm doing a tattoo. Like, hey, this kind of looks kind of cool the way it's going, so I think I might continue with it. So with this piece, what I wanted to do is it's called 7 Deadly Sins, and if you can notice in the cross, it's got the flesh being pulled in 7 different ways. And that kind of represents the way sin kind of takes you in different directions, kind of the meaning behind this piece. So what I have going in my head is I'd like to have it in the shape of a cross, and I'm also considering putting a cross in the background, like the flesh is covering over, like the sin has corrupted over, I guess you can say, salvation. But on this part right here, what I'm doing is just laying down my base colors, kind of getting an idea of where the shadows would go. Now normally what I would be doing is I would be using light source, really considering where my light source is coming from. However, sometimes with tattoos, you do think about that, but you don't also at the same time. You're thinking about, okay, let's lay down shading so that the tattoo can pop more versus an overall like, okay, is the composition correct, is the light sourcing correct, stuff like that. It sometimes makes for a better tattoo. Not all the time, but it does sometimes help, just so you can actually see the exact tattoo, what it's supposed to be, not if it's actually artistically correct, if you will. So it just kind of change your mind a little bit about that, play with it. I'm not saying that's the best way to go, but that is a way to go. So here in the portion of the video, what I'm doing is I'm just making a generic cross. I'm using the rectangle shape tool, and I'm just kind of repathing it to kind of get an idea of like, hey, here's how the cross is going to form in the background of the overlaying flesh. It is something that I was playing with. I was a little concerned whenever I was doing it. Is it going to be too busy? Do I have to make the cross a lighter color because I'm choosing to go really dark so that way the tattoo really stands out in the foreground? And usually, like in art, the foreground is always darker versus the background. The background's always going to get faded out a little bit. Your foreground will always be darker. It's kind of like a camera too. When you set your camera for the foreground, it's going to be sharper, more precise versus the background. It depends on your, I believe that's called your, oh god, I can't even, don't even quote me on that. I'm not a photographer, but I think that's your aperture, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm not too sure. But here what I'm doing is I'm just going to go ahead and start making the foreground just pop a little bit. And the style that I draw, especially with pencil and paper, is I use a lot of line work and shadows just to kind of add a little bit more goriness to the overall piece that I'm working with. A lot of times if you're trying to go more realist, you're not going to be using such intense lines or intense shadow breaks as I tend to do with a tattoo piece. A tattoo piece, again, you kind of need to look at it a little bit different. You want to show where the lines are. It makes it easier for the tattoo artist to lay down the inks, and it makes it easier to be able to show what the piece is doing without actually going in and spending an enormous amount of time trying to get the shadowing and light source and everything else correct. So it really does help out by just over exaggerating sometimes with a tattoo piece. Now here at the very bottom, again, I'm just redropping some base shadows. I'm just kind of seeing what works for me, how the flesh is going to be folding and bending. And mostly what I'm looking at is, okay, does everything look about the same tone? Does it look like it has the same values? Mostly because the last thing you really don't want one portion to be darker than the other. You kind of want to keep it a little bit consistent. Not too much, but you just kind of want to keep things usually sometimes consistent, especially if you're going to add on to the piece later on. It just makes things kind of separate themselves a little bit better from everything else that might be going on in the piece. Now here, this is where I decided, okay, let's start working on the cross. And on the cross, I wanted to kind of give it a little bit of different shapes, different tones. I was going to shade in the center portion of the cross with a deep black, and then kind of give it a metal texture in the outline pieces of the cross. I wasn't really liking the way it was going. It was making things a little busy. Unless I'm going to add color with black and white, it was just making things way busy. So as I was working on it, I was kind of keeping an eye, like, is it going to work out or is it too much? If I decide to go with color, I can always redrop it back in later whenever I'm getting it tattooed on myself. But for right now, let's just go ahead and take the cross out. So I focused back on just doing the flesh itself, just doing the piece, the foreground, and I decided, okay, let's kind of play with it. Let's see what different areas can do. So on one side, I made it a little bit more of the flesh just kind of being droopy. The other side, it's being pulled, like it's being pulled away from my skin completely. So I'm just kind of playing with it, seeing what really works. Now the one good thing about Photoshop, like I said, I started the cross, but I didn't like the way it was going. So you can just turn off the layer, especially if you use layers. Make sure you start getting really familiar with that, because they really do help out. You can start dropping, like I'm doing here, color. So what you would do is you would create a new layer, start colorizing the area, kind of putting some darker tones here and there, and just kind of see how it goes. And then you can always drop it down with the color, hue and saturation, overlay, soft light, and see what really helps the piece to make it pop. But that's about it, guys. Here also is another portion of a piece that I've done. This is the originals that I had worked on in Adobe Illustrator. They were going great. I enjoyed doing them. This is definitely some of the first pieces that I drew in Illustrator. This is actually technically my very first piece that I'm doing in Photoshop. I've just been practicing, trying to get an idea of the brushes, looking up other YouTube tutorial channels, just getting an idea, like, how can I draw, how can I translate what I've done for so long on pencil and paper or pen and paper over to the digital media. So this has definitely been a great I guess tutorial learning experience for myself as well. And here's where I was just really starting to get a feel how the brushes worked, how the strokes worked, and I started to get my confidence a lot higher and better with using Photoshop from transitioning over from Illustrator, because Illustrator really helped me get a feel for how the pen drew. Then I took over to Photoshop. That way I have a good feel for how the pen works, and I can really start focusing in on, okay, how can I shade? How can I translate the way that I would shade in pencil and paper over into Photoshop? And so far I've been very happy. But thanks again, guys. If y'all have any questions, don't forget to leave them in the comments below. And keep on practicing. Hope you have fun. Take care.